Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Steve Koleno, and before we begin, I want to make it clear that these are confidential remarks intended for professional discussion and strategic reflection only. What you're looking at on this screen is not just a market shift. It's a complete psychological and structural transformation of the real estate industry. For decades, the industry operated on a model where professionals controlled the information, controlled the process, and ultimately controlled the consumer experience. But today, consumers have access to more data, more education, and more transparency than at any other point in history. That changes everything. And because of that, the industry now stands at a crossroads. One path continues protecting outdated systems built around opacity, pressure, and information imbalance. The other path embraces transparency, education, and consumer empowerment. The decision professionals make today will shape who survives, who earns trust, and who becomes irrelevant over the next decade. This presentation is about that shift and why the future will belong to advisors, not gatekeepers. For most of modern real estate history, the professional held the advantage because the professional held the information. Consumers relied on agents to access listings, understand pricing, navigate contracts, and interpret the process. Information scarcity created dependency, and dependency created authority. But that foundation has collapsed. Consumers now walk into conversations already informed. They've researched neighborhoods, compared mortgage scenarios, watched negotiation videos, analyzed pricing history, and even asked AI tools to explain contracts before ever speaking to an agent. That means the old model of trust me because I know more no longer works. And importantly, this shift is not temporary. It is not a trend. It is structural. The industries that ignored this kind of shift in the past, whether it was finance, travel, media, or retail, all experienced the same outcome. Consumers moved toward transparency faster than institutions were willing to adapt. Real estate is now entering that exact moment. The professionals who understand this early will build extraordinary trust. The professionals who resist it will increasingly look defensive, outdated, and disconnected from consumer expectations. What's important to understand is that this transformation did not begin inside real estate. Consumers learned transparency expectations everywhere else first. Amazon trained people to compare pricing instantly. YouTube trained people to educate themselves before making decisions. AI tools now explain complicated topics in plain language 24 hours a day. And review culture taught consumers to question authority instead of automatically trusting it. By the time those expectations reach real estate, the consumer mindset had already changed. The industry simply underestimated how quickly that behavior would transfer into housing decisions. Today, consumers expect clarity before commitment. They expect explanation before pressure. And they expect professionals to help them think, not simply help them transact. That means the old information monopoly is gone permanently. Consumers no longer need someone to unlock information for them. They need someone who can interpret complexity, reduce confusion, and guide decision-making with integrity. That is a completely different role. The real estate industry is no longer moving in one direction. It is actively splitting into two competing philosophies. On one side is the traditional gatekeeper model. This approach depends on information control, pressure-driven sales tactics, hidden incentives, and consumer dependency. Its logic is simple. Complexity creates leverage. But on the other side is the modern advisor model. This model is built around education, transparency, guided simplicity, and consumer-first thinking. Instead of protecting complexity, it removes unnecessary friction. Instead of demanding blind trust, it earns informed trust. And that distinction matters enormously, because consumers today are increasingly rewarding the professionals who teach them, explain things clearly, and create confidence without pressure. The advisor model is not softer salesmanship. It is stronger positioning. Why? Because trust compounds. A consumer who feels informed becomes loyal. A consumer who feels manipulated becomes skeptical. And skepticism spreads rapidly in a connected world. The industry is dividing between those trying to preserve the old system and those building the future system. The language of trust itself has fundamentally changed. In the past, many professionals operated from a position of authority. Statements like, "Don't worry about the details," or "Just sign here," were often accepted because consumers assumed the professional knew best. But today, those same phrases create suspicion. Modern consumers interpret resistance to explanation as a warning sign. And that's because today's consumer psychology is built around participation, not submission. Consumers want to understand their options. They want pricing explained clearly. They want pros and cons discussed openly. They want to feel included in the decision-making process. That creates a completely different emotional outcome. Pressure creates defensiveness. Education creates partnership. And partnership creates loyalty. The important insight here is this. Consumers do not distrust expertise. They distrust expertise that resists scrutiny. The professionals who thrive going forward will be the ones confident enough to explain everything clearly, even when it temporarily slows the transaction. For years, many parts of the industry treated transparency like a legal obligation instead of a strategic advantage. But today, transparency is becoming one of the most powerful trust accelerators in business. Consumers are exhausted by hidden fees, vague pricing language, surprise costs, and unclear incentives. Every moment of confusion creates emotional friction, and friction destroys confidence. The modern advisor understands something critical. Clarity reduces anxiety. When compensation is explained upfront, consumers relax. When service agreements are simple and itemized, consumers feel respected. When conflicts of interest are proactively disclosed, trust increases dramatically. That creates relief. And relief converts into trust faster than almost any marketing campaign ever could. Transparency is no longer optional because consumers compare experiences instantly. The advisor who explains things clearly now stands out more than the advisor who simply markets aggressively. In the future, transparency will not weaken professionals. It will become the defining mark of premium professionals. There was a time when visibility alone created authority. If someone claimed to be the number one agent often enough, consumers frequently accepted it at face value. But that era is fading quickly. Today's consumers investigate claims. They verify expertise. They compare reviews. They research independently before ever initiating contact. That means awareness without credibility has become increasingly fragile. The professionals winning in this new environment are not necessarily the loudest. They are the clearest. They explain negotiation strategy openly. They educate consumers before asking for commitment. They simplify complicated processes without hiding details. And that changes the relationship entirely. Education-first positioning creates authority naturally because consumers associate clarity with competence. Meanwhile, excessive self-promotion increasingly triggers skepticism. Consumers today are asking a different question. They are no longer asking who says they're the best. They're asking, who actually helped me understand this better? The future of real estate belongs to professionals who redefine their role completely. Salespeople focus primarily on closing transactions. Advisors focus on helping consumers make confident decisions, even when that decision does not immediately produce a sale. That distinction is everything. The transactional model depends on urgency, persuasion, and volume. But the advisory model depends on trust, guidance, and long-term relationships. And consumers can feel the difference immediately. The best advisors are not measured only by how many deals they close. They are measured by whether consumers trust them enough to call when they are uncertain, overwhelmed, or trying to avoid making a mistake. That level of trust cannot be manufactured through marketing alone. It is earned through consistency, transparency, and education over time. As AI and automation continue improving, basic information becomes less valuable. Human judgment becomes more valuable. That means the irreplaceable professional of the future will not be the person with access to information. It will be the person capable of creating confidence. If information is now widely available, then the obvious question becomes, what creates value next? The answer is not more data. The answer is human interpretation. AI can surface information instantly. Consumers can search endlessly online. But raw information alone rarely creates confidence. In fact, too much information often creates paralysis. That is where the modern advisor becomes indispensable. The new human advantage is the ability to simplify complexity, interpret context, guide decision making, and apply judgment that technology alone cannot replicate. Consumers do not simply need facts, they need perspective. They need someone who can explain what matters, what risks exist, what trade offs are reasonable, and how to think clearly under emotional pressure. That is a fundamentally higher value role than gatekeeping access to information. The professionals who embrace this shift will become more trusted than ever before. The professionals who resist it will increasingly compete against free information, and free usually wins. So, what does the modern advisor actually do differently? First, they explain incentives before being asked. They remove uncertainty proactively instead of defensively reacting later. Second, they simplify complexity. Their goal is not to impress consumers with jargon. Their goal is to create understanding. Third, they provide real options, even when one option may benefit them less financially, because credibility grows when consumers believe the advice is objective. Fourth, they teach evaluation frameworks. They help consumers think critically instead of emotionally. Fifth, they build trust architecturally, not through promises, but through systems, processes, transparency, and consistency. And finally, they empower decisions instead of pressuring decisions. That last point is critical. The measure of success is no longer simply whether a transaction closes today. The real measure is whether the consumer leaves feeling informed, respected, and confident enough to refer others later. That is how modern trust compounds into long-term market dominance. This framework represents what modern consumers increasingly reward in every professional relationship. Transparency means every fee, incentive, and expectation is disclosed clearly from the beginning. Optionality means consumers feel they have choices, not pressure. Disclosure means conflicts and trade-offs are discussed openly before they become problems. Education means consumers leave interactions smarter and more confident than when they arrived. And accountability means the relationship continues after the transaction, not just until the commission clears. Together, these pillars create something incredibly valuable: lasting trust. And lasting trust compounds. It compounds into referrals, reputation, resilience, and long-term credibility that competitors cannot easily replicate. What's fascinating is that this framework often makes the professional's job harder in the short term. It requires more explanation, more patience, and more discipline. But in the long term, it creates an almost unassailable reputation advantage. At some point, every professional in this industry will have to make a decision. Will they spend their energy defending systems built around opacity and control? Or will they help build a future centered on trust, education, and transparency? Because the market is already making its choice. Consumers are becoming more informed, more skeptical, and more empowered every year. That trend will not reverse. The professionals who adapt early will build trust faster than competitors can react. The professionals who wait for industry consensus may eventually discover that consumer expectations move far ahead of them. This moment is not about abandoning professionalism. It is about elevating professionalism. The future belongs to the people willing to lead with clarity, even when clarity feels uncomfortable. Because trust is becoming the most valuable asset in the entire industry. The shift we've discussed today is not theoretical. It is already happening. We are moving from gatekeeping to guidance, from information asymmetry to consumer empowerment, from manufactured authority to demonstrated integrity. And in that environment, the future will not belong to the loudest salesperson. It will belong to the clearest advisor. The professionals who succeed over the next decade will be the ones who educate openly, explain honestly, simplify complexity, and create trust before asking for commitment. Because consumers no longer reward control the way they once did. They reward clarity, and clarity creates confidence. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to building a more transparent and trusted future for this industry. This has been Confidential Remarks.